Hi, I am Astou, an economist at Freddie Mac Singer Family. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I am excited and honored to be moderating our first session of the day, Market Watch and Economic Segments. First, Len Kiefer, Freddie Mac Deputy Chief Economist, will provide a macroeconomic overview and discuss rural house prices. Next, we'll have Jessica Lautz, Deputy Chief Economist at the National Association of Realtors, share key data and insights on home sales and trends in the real estate market. Then, Robert Dietz, SVP and Chief Economist at the National Association of Home Builders, will discuss housing supply and new construction challenges. And with that, Len, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Astou. Great to be here at the Rural Research Symposium. I'm Len Kiefer. I'm in the Economic and Housing Research Group at Freddie Mac. I'm going to get us started on the discussion today. It's talking a bit about the overall economy from a broad macroeconomic view, what's going on in the growth and the labor market and interest rates, just to kind of set a baseline of where we are here in the late part of 2024. And then have a couple remarks related to the housing market and then specifically on rural, just a little bit there. And then I'm going to turn it over to my, fellow panelists who've got some other great information. So just to get us started, I want to talk about the broad economy, just to give us a basis of what we're seeing right now and how, things have been going. Actually, for the U.S. economy as a whole, it's been very solid growth. There was a lot of concern about whether or not the U.S. economy was gonna, hold up in 2024, and so far it's been pretty solid. The economic growth of around 3% is well above, the average from, the prior, part of this last, 20 years or so. We averaged around 2% overall growth. So GDP growth trending around 3%. Consumer spending has held up very strong. And so the U.S. economy, despite some potential headwinds, which we'll get into, has been performing really well, especially when you compare around the world. U.S. economy is just going really well. That's provided sort of the solid sort of footing for the housing market. Now, there absolutely are some headwinds, as we'll get into here, but they just kind of want to dwell on that because a lot of times, if you look at sort of the accounts in the media and how they've characterized the economy, there's negative news often sells, and so that's sort of where folks often focus. But I think the fundamental story for the economy is actually incredibly good. You got solid growth, consumer spending coming out of the pandemic. There was a concern as financial conditions tightened, interest rates came up, savings from a lot of the pandemic programs started to fade, which they are slowly fading. Consumers are drawing that down, that the U.S. economy would lose, energy and steam and potentially head into recession. Now, that's certainly always a possibility, but if we just look at sort of economic news coming here in, the late fall of 2024, current tracking into the third quarter and now even in the fourth quarter, early returns are looking pretty solid there. So overall, economy, at least backward looking, has held up. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't hit a slowdown. And so if we look ahead, we ought to be thinking, well, where is the concern? The concern is it really on the U.S. labor market because employment growth is so central, particularly if you think about housing demand. And certainly we've seen a deceleration in job growth, job gains out of the pandemic. Of course, there was adjustments and we shut the economy down, restarted it. So in 2021 and even early 2022, we were still sort of absorbing that pandemic shock. But as you got into 2023, in early 2024, you see job gains start to decelerate, right? Job growth through September, about 250,000 jobs for September 2024, which is a very solid growth rate. The longer term trajectory is a bit down, but overall, it's natural that we would see job growth be a little bit lower than what we had seen, in 2023, even just because given the population and dynamics. So you can see that in the unemployment rate. The overall U.S. unemployment rate is around 4%, a little bit above 4% there in September of 2024. It ticked up a bit from the lows again in 2023. So the labor market is definitely a bit slower than it was a couple of months ago. but far cry from recession. Now, there were some concerns in summer when the unemployment rate was ticking up that perhaps we were beginning to see a more material slowdown, and that we potentially could trigger, recession by certain ways of looking at the labor market. You might consider that being a recession sign. Subsequent revisions of the data actually have sort of mitigated a lot of that concern. And so that's been good news. The labor market's cooling, but not in recession territory again. So we've got solid overall economic growth at the top level. You've got a labor market that's cooling, but not tipping over into recession. That's all really good news. Now, the one area where there has been concern, that's been driving a lot of the dynamics which will affect the housing market, as we'll get to, is the inflation front. Now, inflation, again, we're on a good path in terms of coming down. You saw inflation rates reach very high levels coming out of the pandemic. There's a lot of stimulus into the economy. Interest rates were very low. We had a lot of, programs to support American households during those difficult times. That spending, and that those low interest rates did result in high inflation. There was concern that would, persist. And so the Federal Reserve began aggressively tightening rates there. And that has brought inflation down. Now, we're not all the way back to target here through, late summer, early fall. We're still running a little bit above target. The core PCE price index is the Fed's preferred inflation measure. I got a bunch of different ones on the chart here, but if you look at that light blue one, it's running about 2.7% as of August on a year-over-year basis. Target's about 2%. So there's still some room to improve to bring inflation back down fully consistent. And if you look at some of the more recent developments here in the late fall, after the Fed started actually cutting rates, interest rates dropped, but then they picked up a little bit. Part of that is because there's some concern that inflation may not be completely back on track, and the speed at which it adjusts is something that we're going to have to continue to watch going forward. It's moderating. As that comes down, that will give some room for potential interest rate reductions, which are going to be really critical as we think about what this will mean for the U.S. housing market. Now, the Federal Reserve cut rates there in September. Prior to that, actually, market was anticipating those interest rate cuts. And in some sense, the market may have gotten a little bit out in front. Certainly at the beginning of this year, market, look at futures markets and other, estimates of where the interest rates may be. They're pricing 6 rate cuts. That seems very unlikely at the current point that we'll end up getting that. The market, got very excited with a 50 basis point cut in September. Then subsequent data in the October early got the market reassessing that situation. And so the interest rate, a lot of it was front loaded, right? A lot of the decrease in the mortgage rate that got down to the low 6s there at the end of September was in anticipation actually of already baked in. And so a lot of the forward-looking views on where rates may head is going to depend on how the market interprets incoming data. And in early October, a lot of that was moving towards, perhaps a little bit less of an aggressive Fed potentially on the future. And so that subsequently interest rates picked up a little bit. I also want to stress, when we look at interest rates, particularly the mortgage interest rate, we have gotten used to, if we look at the last, couple of years of data, actually the last decade, to abnormally low interest rates. So Freddie Mac has been tracking mortgage interest rates in the United States going all the way back up to 1971. So Freddie Mac and the mortgage rate survey are both Gen Xers, in the sense of going back to the early 70s, right? From 71 up through 2024. And we tracked interest rates over decades. And an interest rate of around 6% is really close to historic average. Now, I know sometimes you think the economy has shifted, so maybe the 20th century isn't that relevant. But there were a lot of unique circumstances coming out of the global financial crisis into COVID pandemic of the, decade from 2010 through 2020, 2022, right? That period was very unusual for the U.S. economy. And so if we think longer term, a mortgage interest rate of 4% may be too much to hope for. And so we may need to reassess where we think interest rates may be, depending on what your view is, but something in the 6%, range is probably not so far from historic average and what we may expect going forward. And so the era of low interest rates certainly could come back, right? You don't want to ever say nothing will happen ever again, right? Because things certainly, the environment could change, things could switch up, interest rates could fall, likely in a very negative economic scenario, in the near term. But, most likely, if you just think longer term where interest rates, this, let's call it somewhere in the 5.5% to 6.5% range, mortgage rates will settle, which is much higher than where they have been in recent years, but by a historic perspective, probably in line with what would be averages. You can see the colorful chart there kind of showing you where we got used to interest rates falling by about 2% a decade from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s. And even in the early 2020s, we got down below 3% for a 30-year mortgage rate. Subsequently moved back higher, probably going forward something a bit higher. If that's true, that's going to mean that affordability, which has been a challenge, is going to be an increased factor. It's not going to be temporarily. It's not going to be temporary. It's going to be a longer-term issue, and it's certainly been a long-term issue. If we look at sort of the demographics, I know Jessica, who's coming up here shortly, has some more information on that for you. But just that in backward looking, we've had very strong first-time homebuyer demand nationally, and that's put pressure on the housing market in terms of entry-level prices, which over from the year 2000 through recent data is up 63% relative to high-end home prices. There's a lot of renter households with high incomes that potentially could buy. There are about 30 renter households for every home available for sale right now. That's putting enormous pressure on housing affordability and creating challenges, which I'm sure we'll be discussing today and throughout. But what does that all mean for rural housing, right? If we think about an economic environment, economy's doing all right, doing pretty well, labor market's doing okay. What is how's that going to interact with rural housing markets? And so I want to talk just a little bit of analysis I did specific to rural markets and specifically looking at house prices. And so as affordability has become a massive challenge, we've looked a lot at Freddie at different data on migration about how people are moving around. It's been very clear that affordability is one of the drivers that drive people's movement and location decisions. And rural areas in general have lower overall house prices. And so if we compare the gains in rural housing prices relative to non-rural areas, and we adjust for the location, right? So if we control for being in the similar locations, so sim, state, and metro, or state areas, right? That's what this black chart here is showing. The red chart doesn't control for state and metro. But if we look at state and metro controls and we ask sort of how are rural areas doing, since about 2020, price growth in rural areas has been higher than house price growth in non-rural areas. In the 2023, about 1.6 percentage points higher house price growth in rural areas relative to non-rural areas. It's because, I think, largely because of affordability and that folks that are getting priced out of expensive metro areas are looking for places where they can have an opportunity. Rural areas potentially offer that. And if they are, with remote work options, there may be more people that are looking into that. So I just want to leave that kind of data point there as an interesting sort of aspect of what's happening with rural markets as we see the discussion going further throughout today. But again, that was just my high-level summary. Overall economy doing pretty solid. Labor market's cooling. Inflation's coming down. Interest rates maybe a little bit higher than what some are hoping for, and that's going to put the pressure on affordability. And rural markets have very good affordability relative to some of the more expensive metro areas and other places. And so that's going to be an interesting dynamic to study going forward. So now I want to turn it over to my fellow panelist, Jessica Lautz from NAR, who's going to talk about trends in the real estate market. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Len. Great information to start us out with. And yep, I'm going to jump right into demographics, but I also just want to level set with the housing market. So what we're collecting, what we have seen in the last year is that into 2024, the housing market has been quite sluggish. If you ask realtors today, they will tell you we are in a housing recession, and we do seem to have much lower home sales activity than what we have had historically. If we look at the summer months, continuing to be quite sluggish. The U.S. population has grown by 70 million people since 1995, but unfortunately, home sales activity is still at that level. So we're just not meeting the needs of the population today. Unfortunately, do not have enough homes, both for existing inventory, but also for new inventory. And I know Robert Dietz will be covering that next from the home builders. With that, home prices continue to gain. We know that home prices are continuing to go up, even for existing homes in a sluggish market. and now are closer on par with new homes than what we have seen historically. This is quite unusual, as we know that new homes have the bells and whistles, have beautiful features within them that consumers would want, as opposed to an existing inventory of a housing stock that can be quite old, could need system repairs, could need upgrading, new kitchens, and so on, that they do not have. Even in the sluggish market that we saw in the last month, we know that 20% of homes still moved over the asking price for existing home inventory because of the lack of inventory that is out there. So Len had talked quite a bit about mortgage interest rates and what that means for consumers today. So if we pair that mortgage interest rate with the rise in home prices, what we get is that the qualifying income for a home buyer just continues to go up. What we see right now in the last month is that the typical household would need to make nearly $109,000 to qualify for the typical home out there. That being said, that's with 20% as a down payment. We know that that is the ideal and honestly quite rare. For the typical first-time home buyer in the last year, their down payment was under 10%. So we know that this is very unlikely for a first-time home buyer to be able to scratch that money together and to be able to save. And so what we have seen, unfortunately, is in the last month, first-time home buyers have actually dropped to the lowest level that we have ever seen historically. They are really struggling to enter into today's home buying market, and housing affordability and the lack of inventory is really what is holding them back from being able to purchase a home. For successful first-time home buyers, I think it's worth noting too that their typical household income has gone up by $25,000 in 1 year, which means that we are really pricing out of today's housing market people who we desperately need, like school teachers, like first responders. They are being priced out of today's housing markets within local communities. We are starting to see more inventory come up. One of the cautionary things I would say, though, is that when we look at the headlines, when we look at the percent increases of existing homes coming up and coming into the market, we are still not even matching what we saw in February of 2020 before there was a excess of demand in the housing market because of extremely low interest rates. So we are not even at that marker yet, though we are seeing more homes coming into the market today. The lock-in effect of low interest rates is real. There's a lot of consumers unwilling or unable to move, and also just the inability to be able to have that movement in the housing market is really creating that lock-in effect. One of the things that I would say is that while I've talked a lot about affordability, we know that this is a bifurcated market. We know this is a quite different market for homeowners who are continuing to gain housing equity. In fact, we know that 26% of homes in the last month were all cash. And for the last about 22 months of the housing market, more than a quarter of homes have actually been all cash purchases. So really, homeowners who have been in their homes for longer periods of time really being the winners. The job market continues to be quite positive. I'll gloss over this because I know this has been covered, but I do think that it is worth noting it's just in really 3 areas of the country, Hawaii, Louisiana, and DC, we are not seeing a positive percent gain in job growth in comparison to March of 2020, but really rebounds, especially if we look at the mountain states, Texas, and Florida. Population has been moving. So where we saw those job growths, we really do see a population change there too. So people being very much attracted in the last year, moving to those mountain states, moving to the Sun Belt, anywhere in blue continues to have a gain in population. What I will say too, and what I think is quite interesting, is this is data that is self-reported on this next slide here. This is from the home buyer perspective. So what I will say is this is probably not a strict definition of what a small town or a rural area or a suburban area even is, but what we have seen is that small towns and rural areas are more popular, not as popular as what we had seen in the really pandemic move era, where people really moved to small towns and rural areas as they wanted bigger homes. But we still do see that this is quite attractive to move to. In fact, for millennial home buyers, it is as likely to move into a small town as an urban setting. I think that's quite striking. We know that they may be wanting a larger home, they may be wanting a yard, but also housing affordability is playing a role here. If you can't find an affordable property in an inner suburb, a city center, you're going to be looking outwards. And so we're seeing that people are purchasing homes outside of city centers because of that as a driver as well, just housing affordability and availability. I want to give a few demographics here. I've alluded to first-time home buyers, but I just want to look at the population moving forward too, because I think it gives us a good indication of where housing demand is going to be coming from. As we look at the population as a whole, what we can see, this is everyone in the country today. So we've got little kiddos born in the last couple of years in the green, and as the bars get shorter, my understanding of the world is people become ghosts. It's spooky season after all, or they go to heaven, one of the two. So we have fewer people in the gray. Really importantly, in the middle of the chart here is the blue. That is the millennial generation today. What I want to pull out is a couple things here. The median age of a repeat buyer today is 35 years old. That is towards the oldest that we have ever seen it. Historically, the typical first-time home buyer used to actually be in their late 20s. So it's taking a first-time home buyer longer to save for a home, a harder time finding a property, paying down student loan debt, credit card debt, etc. But what I want to point out here too is that the demand that we're seeing in the housing market today is not going away overnight. Len alluded to the affordability crisis not going away overnight. Well, the population is not going away either. And what I can see quickly on this chart is that we have a large population, a population boom I would say, that we can see in the late 20s, early 30s. That's putting pressure on the for purchase market right now. But if we look past that into the green, what we can see here too is in the late teens, early 20s, that's putting pressure on the rental market as well. So these young adults really trying to live independently will be graduating from college, high school, and so on, and putting continual pressure into this low inventory housing market that we're seeing today. A lot of people are looking to baby boomers as saying this is the silver tsunami that's coming, that they will die off, they will leave their homes to the young adults out there. What I will give as the counter argument is that that's not going to happen overnight. And the reason why I say that is that the second red bar is the median age of 58 years old. At 58, that is the median age of a repeat buyer today. And what we are seeing is that people are making housing trades later in life. They are taking on a mortgage or they're purchasing their home with all cash, and they're feeling quite comfortable making this large financial transaction at this time period. And they're planning on holding onto that home for about 15, 20 years. They're not leaving that property anytime soon. So the need for more housing inventory really is out there. The Gen Xers wedged in between the two of them have financially rebounded from the Great Recession. They had a very difficult time coming out of the financial crisis, but are doing all right now. So on steady footing. What I will say about the Gen X population, and what I think is important to note, is that 19% of those Gen X buyers actually purchased a multi-generational home. One in which they're taking care of aging parents, kids over the age of 18 who are still living in that property, so they're not living independently yet, or have boomeranged back. They may have kids under the age of 18. And so when we look at multi-generational buying overall for all generations, we see it pretty much at an all-time high. It's at 14% of all buyers right now. A lot of demand for this type of property because there's a lot of Americans who are doubling up. Again, that housing demand not going away. It's a lot of pent-up demand as people are doubling up in this economy, not being able to live independently at this moment. The other demographic change I want to give you too is that we see a lot of single households in today's economy and just overall in the US. So if we look back historically, we know that in the 1960s, 70% of American adults were married. Today it's just about half. As we look at home buyer activity, we can see nearly a third of all home buyers are single. I'm showing you first-time home buyers, but I could really show you any generation here. I could show you any cut of this, and what you would be seeing is the same pattern. We have fewer married couples and we have more singles in the market. We do have more unmarried couples entering into the real estate market, and we have more roommates who are entering into the real estate market. And perhaps, especially as we look at roommates, they could want a different home product than what they're currently seeing. Not a small bedroom, but two equally sized bedrooms, for instance. For singles, perhaps needing a smaller property than a large McMansion, certainly. So a different type of home buyer and a different part of the affordability section of the housing market too. Just thinking about a single income versus a dual income couple, especially as we talk about single women who have the lowest household incomes. And the last one I want to give you for a demographic shift here is that birth rates overall in this country are down. There's more empty nesters as we see older home buyers, housing market that's really dominated by repeat buyers who are older. So as we see this, what we can see is that back in 1985, 58% of home buyers had a child under the age of 18 in their household. Today, it's just 30%. It's a historic low. So as we see this, that's going to change the number of moves that someone could have, but also the housing products that they need, the location of the home that they're located in. So all of these are shifting priorities for home buyers today, and a really different type of home buyer that's out there. If you're not following us on social, that's my plug. Please do follow us on social. We got a lot of nerds in our group who are putting out great information on a daily basis. But that, I will turn it over to Robert Dietz. He's the chief economist at the Home Builders, and a great resource. So happy to turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, this is great information. And thank you to Freddie Mac for hosting this event. I want to take a look at the supply side. That's been the kind of the binding constraint for the housing market since the Great Recession, that's caused some of the challenges in affordability that we talked about today. I want to take a look at some of this data through a rural focus, of course. But I thought we'd start with actually something that Len had on one of his slides, looking at the recent sources of inflation. This is basically the same data that Len presented. You've got in blue the CPI, so the growth in consumer prices. And then in red, we've highlighted the shelter inflation component. And over the last year, more than half of the overall gain in consumer prices has actually been shelter inflation. And what's driven shelter inflation to grow faster than prices for the overall economy has been the lack of housing inventory and the higher cost of construction. Those are the challenges. And it's particularly felt in rural markets where it can be more difficult to build due to labor constraints, lending constraints, and I'll walk you through some of the data on those individual items. Something, though, before we get to some of the supply side factors that I hear from builders all over the country that I think is going to be a growing challenge is the cost of insurance. If you look at the aggregate data, insurance prices are up roughly 17% since 2020. But in a lot of local markets, those prices are up considerably more. I mean, there's places in Florida and Louisiana seeing insurance costs 300% higher than they were just a few years ago. And we think this is going to be a growing challenge. You can say, okay, well, that's mostly just a coastal issue. But we took this map from a great MBER working paper that shows annual premiums for homeowners insurance. And you can see quite clearly it's not just a coastal issue. It's one that affects, for example, Tornado Alley or other kinds of rural markets. So I think insurance is going to be something that policymakers are going to have to tackle in the coming years as part of that greater affordability issue. All right, so let's take a look at some of the supply side factors, things that have limited home builder supply over the last decade. And we'll start with the big one, which is building material costs since the pandemic. If you look at this is the year-over-year growth rate in aggregate residential construction material costs. So all the materials weighted by the amount that are used to conduct single-family building, multifamily construction, and remodeling. You can see in 2021 and 2022, those growth rates were really high. You had months where it was above a 20% year-over-year growth rate. On net, it's raised the aggregate the price of residential construction material costs by about 30% since COVID. And of course, then that spills over into the housing market, raises the cost of construction, makes home prices higher, particularly new home prices, and also limits the amount of supply that can take place. And if you ask builders what the big issue on the building material side since COVID, it's lumber costs. Here you've got the actual level prices of lumber. You can see from 2020 to 2021, lumber prices increased from $350 per thousand board feet to $1,500 per thousand board feet, easily adding $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to the framing cost of a new single-family home. Now, the good news is that lumber prices have come down. They're around $400 per thousand board feet, but there are still challenges in the market. For example, we get about a third of our lumber from Canada, and right now there's a 15% effective tariff rate on imported Canadian softwood lumber. And so if we're thinking about the future of lumber costs, we know that single-family home building is going to increase as mortgage interest rates move lower. And with the imposition of those tariffs, 2018 might offer a good model of what the future of lumber prices are going to be in the coming years. You can see that during that time period, lumber prices increased $400 to $500 per thousand board feet. And I think builders and consumers need to be prepared for higher lumber costs ahead. Labor, skilled labor has been a limiting factor. Any given month, the construction industry is short 300,000 to 400,000 workers. You can see that blue line really kind of dipping in 2024. We had a few months where that number fell. I think that was due to a softening of the construction labor market due to some of the declines in multifamily construction. But generally speaking, this is a generational problem. And as I said earlier, it's felt more acutely in rural markets where you have a smaller amount of people and it's harder to assemble those construction crews. So this is a particular challenge in low density environments in terms of obtaining the necessary construction workers to undertake single family construction and remodeling. And another challenge for builders in recent years has been the cost and availability of builder loans. Now, these are loans to private home builders who are responsible for about 60% of the single-family home building in the country. They go get financing to acquire and develop lots. That's the A and the D. And for the construction part, that's the C of A, D, and C financing from community and regional banks. And so those interest rates, which you can see in the text box here, have been really high after the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy. In our surveys, we found 13 to 15% average annualized effective interest rates on development and construction loans. Now, the good news here is the Fed does cut, and we expect the Fed funds rate to move from 5% now down to about 3%. These interest rates will move down as well on a one-for-one basis because they're short-term interest rates. They're much closer to what the Fed controls than, say, long-term interest rates, which are dictated like mortgage interest rates, for example, or move along with the 10-year Treasury rate. So we expect the cost of these loans to improve and the availability to improve, and that should help housing supply. However, from a rural home building context, you have to keep in mind that it's harder to get these loans in rural markets, and it's really an important limiting factor in terms of adding housing supply in what we think are markets that are seeing growing demand in the post-COVID environment. Lot sizes, I just included this one here at the end. It's something to note that we're places in the country where we've seen gains in single-family home building. There are places where lot sizes have shrunk. So if you look at the purple and the black on this slide, that represents the share of home building lots that are built on lots smaller than a fifth of an acre. Back in the year 2000, it was actually under 50% of such lots. Today, it's closer to 65%. So one of the most important limiting factors on the amount of housing inventory and home building has been zoning issues in the last decade. And I think this data illustrates in places where you can build with a little bit more density than maybe we're used to, housing supply will increase. And that applies to rural markets, which admittedly do have larger lots. But zoning reform is going to be a key area where we can identify places that are going to grow in terms of home building and therefore see improvements in terms of housing inventory. All right, so with that, let's take a look then at our forecast. This is our single-family starts forecast. After declines in 2022 and 2023, We're looking for about a 5% gain in single-family home building this year, getting us close to about 1 million single-family starts, an additional improvement in 25, and additional gains in 2026. To put it into context, we think we need to be building somewhat more than 1.1 million single-family homes a year to reduce the housing deficit that accumulated during the 2012 to 2019 period. And that number can be measured in the millions. So getting up to about 1.1 million or higher is really critical to reducing that housing deficit. We think we're headed there. It's just going to take some time. As we said before, it's taken about a decade to get into this housing shortage and housing affordability crisis. It's probably going to take us about a decade to fully get out of it. And then I want to take a look at some of the geography of home building. This will give us that focus on rural markets. What you're seeing here are maps, map listing counties in orange that represent the outer suburbs of smaller metropolitan areas. So you can think of these as sort of the outer suburbs or exurbs of medium-sized cities. You can see that it's about 9.9% of single-family home building in the recent data, and the recent annualized growth rate is around 16%. Now, if we shift out to a lower density area outside those orange counties, so these counties in yellow, these represent small towns across the United States. It's a slightly smaller market share, representing about 6.4% of single-family home building. And the growth rate's actually been a little bit slower, around a 3% growth rate. Now, if we shift additional decline in density to these counties in red, these are true rural counties, and they represent about 4% of single-family home building. So if you combine that prior map of yellow combined with this map of red, you've got about 10% of single-family home construction that occur in broadly measured rural housing markets. And notice all three of these different maps are showing a gain in single-family home building this year, and we think that will continue as we move forward next year. And as I said before, we've got about 10% of single-family home building in these rural markets. What I've got here on this pie chart is where home building takes place by the type of development. So you've got in red about 60% in communities. This would include master plan communities. About 9% is tear down construction in existing neighborhoods. This is kind of a one-for-one replacement. About 20% is infill in established older neighborhoods. And then you've got about 14%. This would include much of that 10% rural market share that I showed you earlier. 14% that's not in a individual residential development. It's one-off type home building. And a good example of that is what we call the custom home building market. Now, that's not a design designation. It's really references the type of construction. This is home building that's undertaken under a construction contract. It's not for sale. The builder never owns the lot or the home. They're just working under a construction contract. And it represents about 20% of the home building market. These are larger, more expensive homes to older buyers, and they are disproportionately built in rural housing markets. And then lastly, I just want to walk you through some maps on the multifamily side. These market shares, of course, because it is apartment construction, are going to be smaller than the single family market shares. But again, here you've got outer suburbs of medium-sized cities. This represents about 4% of apartment construction. You can see it has a negative growth rate, negative 10% growth rate over the last year for multifamily construction. Apartment construction is really going to be down this year. We're expecting about a 30% decline in multifamily starts. And the reason for that was at the end of last year, there were about 1 million apartment units in the construction pipeline. So this is about 4% of multifamily. And if we, again, kind of shift out to these small towns, it represents about 3% of multifamily construction is in small towns across the country. And then in red, this final map is about 1% of multifamily construction here in rural areas. So if you combine that together, 4% of multifamily units, disproportionately 2 to 10 unit type multifamily, is built in rural markets. All of this showing a production decline. We think it will stabilize later in 2025 and eke out a small gain by the time we get into 2026. And then lastly, I've mentioned single family and multifamily construction. We are bullish on the remodeling market. Keep in mind, we have an aging housing stock. The average age of a single-family owner-occupied home in the United States right now is above age 40. Reinvestment, improving energy efficiency, improving resiliency is going to be really critical. And all of this suggests that the remodeling market is going to continue to grow. Our remodelers have never been negative in terms of market sentiment during the post-COVID period. You can't say that about single-family and multifamily construction, and we think that trend is going to continue. And with that, I want to thank Freddie Mac again for hosting. It was great to be able to join the other panelists, and I'll turn it over to Astou.
Thank you, Len, Jessica, and Robert, for your excellent presentations. I think we've all learned a lot today. I learned from Len's presentation that the economy has been growing, labor market is cooling, but good news, we're not in a recession yet. And as he mentioned, inflation has been decreasing a little bit, but it's not all the way down to target yet. Affordability remains challenged with high interest rates. We learned from Jessica's and Rob's presentations that housing supply also remains challenged, both in terms of new and existing inventory, especially with the lock-in effect. Home prices continue to increase even for existing homes. First-time home buyers and rural consumers in particular have been having a really hard time achieving home ownership, with income requirements for mortgage financing going up, and homeowner insurance costs have also been increasing quite a bit. And so we're going to round this session with Ashely Williams, public health analyst at the National Center for Healthy Housing, and Sarah Goodwin, policy manager also from the National Center for Healthy Housing. And Ashely and Sarah will share insights about the work that they've been doing on health and housing.
Great. Thanks, Astou. My name is Sarah Goodwin. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the National Center for Healthy Housing. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ashely Williams, who is a public health analyst here at NCHH. We're so excited to be presenting to you today about some of the work we've done over the past couple of years in supporting healthy housing needs and opportunities in rural areas. Today, we'll be sharing some key takeaways from a few different projects we've done over the past couple of years, starting with a survey and a roundtable, and including a mini grant opportunity we offered earlier this year. Just briefly, NCHH is a national nonprofit. We've been around for over 30 years. We do a whole lot, including research and advocacy work, but today we'll be sharing some work we do under our capacity building program, where we spend a fair amount of time working with local and state communities to ensure that they have the best data, tools, policies, practices, resources, models, and other information in order to address healthy housing needs in their communities. So the first thing we wanted to share, the first thing we did when we kind of embarked on this process of looking specifically at healthy housing needs in rural areas, was a questionnaire to folks who are working on healthy housing in their communities, defined as rural, kind of however they wanted to define it and tell us about it. This is a partnership with the National Environmental Health Association. We received 180 responses from folks providing services in 37 states. There's a full summary report that has a lot more information that's available on our website. One of the main things we asked was just about what are the biggest healthy homes issues or needs that they're seeing in their service area. And the most popular answers we heard about were energy efficiency and weatherization, mold, pest infestations, structural issues, and injury prevention, lead, and then poor indoor air quality, with other issues falling a little, less frequently than some of those key issues. Other really significant overall results we heard kind of across the board. Everyone needs funding for home repair. That was the biggest organizational need that we heard about in terms of people lacking funding, lacking resources. We also heard a strong interest in technical assistance on improving equity and resident access to services. Some of the key challenges that folks told us about included strict eligibility requirements on funding streams, keeping some communities out of being able to access funding to support this work, the high cost of housing and home repair specifically in these communities, a shortage of contractor capacity or just lack of contractors in the area available to do specialized work, and inadequate enforcement of housing codes. Some examples of successes we heard about included strong partnerships, especially partnership work focused on training, and especially training of community health workers was a popular and a successful project we heard about. We also just observed that respondents really see healthy homes as a larger picture of community health and economic activity in these areas. When we asked questions about, key goals or, like dream projects people wanted to complete, healthy housing or home improvement and home repair and addressing housing quality was seen as kind of a package of other projects, including addressing other kind of community health or economic revitalization efforts. Finally, our full report included specific results for groups focused on public health, housing, and healthcare, and some of the differences we observed in those different respondents. And I'm going to turn it over to Ashely for a couple minutes.
Thanks, Sarah. So we, in partnership with the National Environmental Health Association, hosted 3 roundtable discussions that included 10 participants. And in those roundtable discussions, we identified community-specific needs, opportunities, challenges, and we also discussed shared best practices. We took the information gathered during those discussions to develop relevant resources and tools that were tailored towards the strengths and needs of rural communities. So we discussed various topics. One of those topics were, what are some of the biggest healthy housing issues that you see in your rural community? So majority of the participants stated that mold is one of the biggest healthy housing issues. Some of the participants stated that poor indoor air quality is a big issue in their rural community due to a lot of residents using wood stoves to heat their homes. And then also, you can see here on the left, there's a list of other common biggest healthy housing issues that we discussed. So we spent quite a few moments discussing challenges. So some of the major challenges that we discussed were lack of knowledge by funders of what is a rural community. There are various federal definitions of rural communities. CDC has a definition, Census has a definition. However, rural communities feels as though that the various definitions creates a service and economic barrier for them. Also, majority of participants felt as though that their small population size affect their ability to be able to apply for state and primary prevention funds. And then also, some residents felt as though, some participants felt as though that residents were competing for the same inadequate, overpriced, unhealthy homes. They said that because they're from small rural communities, that oftentimes landlords are the ones that are inspecting homes or are code officials. So it makes it harder to report any hazards that they may have in the home. Next, the participants also talked about opportunities for improvement and growth. So some insights from rural communities. Organizations can find opportunities for funding from various sources. Also, they feel as though that cross-sector collaboration was important. And then also, peer networking would be a great opportunity for participants to be informed of lessons learned from other rural communities like their own. Now I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
So after doing this kind of initial landscape analysis, we had the opportunity to offer a mini grant opportunity focused on increasing lead poisoning prevention, specifically in rural areas. This was a partnership between NCHH, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, and the PHI Center for Health Leadership and Impact, with funding from CDC's National Center for Environmental Health. And we had a project period of February to July 2024, so it was super fast. What we are offering here was a bundled award that included a $50,000 grant to local governments, local nonprofits, other groups kind of at the state or local level. And that was bundled with access to technical assistance from national experts and an opportunity to engage in peer connection and peer learning with other communities. The purpose of the project and what we asked people to tell us about in their application was to have communities build their capacity to engage in policy and systems change. It was a super short project time period, but we wanted folks to tell us about how they were going to be laying the groundwork through the work with us to achieve their long-term goals of healthier housing and lead poisoning prevention in their communities. Eligibility for the grant opportunity was limited to organizations in states and territories serving rural or tribal areas. Ashely?
Thanks, Sarah. So we asked the participants to tell us about some project activities that they would like to do if they were awarded. So majority of the participants proposed project activities that focus on enhancing community awareness and resilience. So as you can see on the slide, 73% of the project activities focused on community outreach and education, followed by coalition building, advocacy and policy change, and developing partnerships. Next, we asked the applicants to identify populations in their communities that are disproportionately impacted by lead exposure. 79% of the applicants identified low-income communities as communities that are disproportionately impacted by lead exposure, followed by individuals that live in older homes, children, and communities of color.
So we ended up awarding 5 communities at that $50,000 grant level. That included the American Samoa Department of Health, the City Cali County Health Department located in Kansas, the Healthy Bourbon County Action Team, which is also in Kansas, the Mississippi Communities United for Prosperity, and Young Gifted and Green, which is located in Tennessee. And then we had 2 semifinalists awarded $25,000 grants, which were the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition and Thoughts Before Actions, which is located in Louisiana. So some of the outcomes that we saw, this is not the entire sum total of the outcomes we saw, and I'm also not going to read off this entire slide, but some of the things that our grantees were able to achieve over the course of just 6 months included increased screening for children for blood lead, new partnerships and relationships and coalitions with other partners in their area, engaging the community, hosting training and increasing workforce capacity, obtaining equipment for their programs, and moving toward policy goals. So from all of this work, which is then really kind of, I think, just the beginning, and hopefully we're just the beginning, we're planning to continue our work in understanding rural healthy housing needs and how national organizations can continue to support those communities and build their capacity to address housing quality issues in their areas. Some of the things that we've learned over the course of the past couple of years. Rural communities have really specific capacity challenges and needs that those of us providing national support need to be prepared to meet. 2 kind of examples that jumped out at us included a need for just basic lead 101 education, as well as working in Superfund sites specifically as a particular challenge and barrier that comes up. We also observed that long-term relationship building is super critical, and communities not only need time, but also support, sometimes monetarily, to be able to do and engage in long-term relationship building and partnership building when there's so many other demands for time and capacity in the work that they're doing. And then finally, efforts to increase accessibility to funding streams really do pay off in increasing the spectrum of funded communities. One thing we heard, as Ashely mentioned in our questionnaire and roundtable results, was that different definitions of rural and rurality can create barriers and sometimes inadvertently leave out communities that would otherwise really need that funding or support. When we offered the mini grant opportunity, we didn't include a specific definition of rural. We just asked groups to tell us about their community that needed the support in their application, and describe the groups they'd be working with or that they'd be serving. And we didn't have to screen anybody out for eligibility. Everybody was from a rural community and telling us about it, and we were able to receive a really diverse pool of applicants serving a lot of different types of communities, and had a lot of really strong applications to choose from. So this was kind of a super fast lightning round coverage of some of the work we've done over the past couple of years. Available on our website are write-ups, more in-depth write-ups on the questionnaire and roundtable results, as well as more information about the mini grant recipients specifically and some of the work they were able to accomplish with the funding. We also have a series of resources that gets more into understanding the kind of current landscape of rural healthy housing needs from other data sources and information, as well as some information on addressing these housing needs and particularly harnessing technology. So our contact information is available on the slide, as well as all the information up on our website. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Astou. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all presenters today, Len, Jessica, Robert, Ashely, and Sarah, for your insightful work and great presentations. And thank you everyone for tuning in as well. We will see you for our next session on rural housing trends and affordability.